Hello everyone. Today we will explore the life of Charles Stratton, a little man of Hollywood. Charles Stratton, better known as General Tom Thumb, performed in the circus alongside his wife Lavinia and their children. However, their story held more than a few secrets. Charles's short stature was not inherited from his parents, who were both of average height. Interestingly, his parents were first cousins. His father, Sherwood Edward Stratton, worked as a carpenter, while his mother, Cynthia Thompson, was a cleaner. Despite their modest life, the couple faced an unexpected challenge when their son was born. On January 4, 1838, Charles entered the world as a seemingly normal baby and was even considered large at birth. However, by his first birthday, his parents noticed something alarming. He hadn't grown in the past 6 months. Measuring just 25 inches tall and weighing only 15 pounds, the Strattons sought help from a doctor. Their fears were confirmed. It was unlikely that Charles would ever grow to an average adult height. Still, there was a small comfort. Charles's body was proportionate and healthy. Apart from his size, he was a normal child. Nonetheless, his parents couldn't shake their worries. How would their little boy navigate and succeed in a world built for people so much bigger than him? Fortunately, word of Charles reached the ears of a legend, and his life was changed forever. When Phineas T. Barnum heard about a tiny child in Bridgeport, Connecticut, the greatest showman knew he had to meet him. After tracking Charles down, Phineas knew he'd hit the jackpot. He begged the Strattons for permission to exhibit their 4-year-old son in New York City alongside adults with unusual features. When his parents agreed, the businessman was ecstatic and determined to turn this little boy into a huge star, no matter what. Most 4-year-olds are just learning to read and write, but Charles was no ordinary child. Instead of attending a typical school, he trained to become a performer. This included learning to sing, dance, mime, and even impersonate famous people. Armed with these new skills, Charles needed a shiny and marketable identity, and Phineas had the perfect idea. Charles Stratton was a perfectly fine name, but it lacked the star quality, at least according to Phineas. The showman came up with a stage name, General Tom Thumb. He borrowed it from English folklore. Tom Thumb was a character the size of his father's thumb who got into all kinds of mischief. But Phineas wasn't satisfied with just a new name. The showman invented an entire persona for Charles. He was no longer Charles Stratton, a 4-year-old from Connecticut. To audiences, he became an 11-year-old from England. Worse still, Cynthia, Charles's mother, had no idea about the fabrication until it was too late. She was furious until the act became a hit and money started rolling in. But General Tom Thumb wasn't famous simply because of his backstory or his size. Charles had something that most of us can only dream of: talent and charisma. It didn't take long for him to make a big impact. His earliest performances in New York and his first national tour, all at only 5 years old, were turning points in freak show entertainment. Thanks to General Tom Thumb, this became one of the most popular forms of entertainment at the time. However, success came with a strange problem. Phineas and Charles faced competition from imitators who sought to capitalize on their popularity. Their rivals created imitation versions of General Tom Thumb, and the situation became so troublesome that newspapers began issuing warnings about the wannabes. While they say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, Phineas and Charles probably didn't see it that way since the copycats affected their earnings. Still, the duo had their sights set on bigger goals: global recognition. A year later, Phineas and Charles embarked on a 3-year European tour, dreaming of international fame and fortune. However, their early efforts met with disappointment. Things weren't looking great until Phineas had a stroke of genius. In England, class and status meant everything. Realizing this, Phineas shifted his focus to networking with the upper classes. His persistence finally paid off when he secured an audience with Queen Victoria. Meeting Queen Victoria was a pivotal moment for Charles. In a bold move, he stuck with his usual cheerful and comedic demeanor. even though the royal family was in mourning over Prince Albert's father. Surprisingly, his charm paid off. General Tom Thumb managed to win over Queen Victoria, even playfully pretending to fend off one of her small, noisy dogs. Her approval marked a turning point in Charles's career and changed everything. Thanks to Queen Victoria and his European tour, General Tom Thumb became the most famous entertainer of his time, both in the United States and Europe. Wherever Charles went, he was mobbed by crowds. Many of these admirers were women, some of whom wanted more than just a glimpse of General Tom Thumb, who, it's important to remember, was still a child named Charles Stratton. Women would line up just for the chance to kiss him. This was the reality for the young star, who never got to experience a normal childhood. Being sold to the circus is an unusual and difficult way to begin life. Losing one's childhood to it makes it even harder. Phineas not only lied about Charles's age, but also expected him to act much older than he was. Charles spent nearly all his time with adults and, shockingly, began drinking at the age of 5 and smoking by 7. This was the price he paid for the immense wealth that far exceeded anything the Stratton family could have imagined. Charles's life was far removed from his working-class roots in Connecticut. Under Phineas's management and thanks to his own talents, Charles became extraordinarily wealthy. He developed a taste for luxury and had the means to indulge it. He owned expensive real estate, wore the finest clothes, and even had his own yacht. But perhaps most importantly, his wealth helped him win the heart of the love of his life, Lavinia Warren. Lavinia was also a little person, but her life was vastly different from Charles's. She had a typical childhood and grew up to become a respected school teacher. However, her life took a dramatic turn when she learned about General Tom Thumb. Inspired by his success, Lavinia decided to leave her stable career behind and venture into the unpredictable world of entertainment. Phineas Barnum became her manager, and it was only a matter of time before she met Charles. According to Phineas, it was love at first sight, at least for Charles. He reportedly said, "Mr. Barnum, that is the most charming little lady I have ever seen, and I believe she was created to be my wife. You've always been a friend to me, so I want you to speak to her on my behalf. I have plenty of money, and I want to marry, settle down, and live a happy life. I feel like I must marry that young lady." Determined to win her over, Charles set out on a mission and wouldn't let anything stand in his way. To impress Lavinia, he gave her a tour of his mansion and showcased his luxurious lifestyle. He didn't stop there. They also visited numerous properties he owned around town. His efforts paid off. Lavinia told Phineas, "It seems as if you and Tom Thumb own nearly all of Bridgeport." However, Charles faced competition for her affection. George Washington Morrison Nutt, better known as Commodore Nutt, was also vying for Lavinia's hand. Like Charles, Commodore Nutt was a little person, an entertainer, and part of Phineas's company, and he too was in love with Lavinia. Lavinia was older than Charles and never saw George as more than a sweet young boy. Things became more complicated when Phineas unintentionally added to the drama. He gave Lavinia a diamond and emerald ring, but it didn't fit her. Phineas suggested she give the ring to George as a gesture of friendship. However, George misunderstood and believed it was a sign of her love for him. Meanwhile, Charles wanted Phineas to support his pursuit of Lavinia instead of George. To win him over, Charles promised that if Phineas helped him marry Lavinia, he would have a public wedding, which would make Phineas even richer. Tempted by the promise of wealth, Phineas persuaded Lavinia to consider Charles. Predictably, George felt deeply betrayed by this turn of events. The love triangle between Lavinia, Charles, and George reached its peak in dramatic fashion. According to Phineas, the rivalry between George and Charles over who had the right to court Lavinia escalated into a physical fight at work. Phineas claimed George started it by throwing Charles to the ground, but that was only the beginning. One evening, George went to Phineas's house, only to discover Charles and Lavinia alone together in a parlor. Charles had proposed to Lavinia, and she had accepted. George was devastated, feeling utterly betrayed by both Phineas and Charles. He found it nearly impossible to forgive them for what he saw as a terrible betrayal. Despite George's feelings, the show and the wedding had to go on. The dramatics didn't stop there. In fact, a blackmailer disrupted their wedding planning. A woman threatened to publish unflattering things about Charles and Lavinia. However, nobody batted an eye. Phineas even dared her. "You may print 100,000 copies." To the showman, there was no such thing as bad publicity. In 1863, Charles married Lavinia in New York City. The wedding was many things, but intimate it was not. The newlyweds even stood on top of a grand piano to greet their 10,000 guests. The maid of honor was Minnie Warren, Lavinia's sister and fellow little person, which was to be expected. Charles's best man was George. Certainly less so. Charles had promised to make Phineas a fortune from his wedding. They even sold tickets to the reception for $75, roughly $1,800 today, and yet it still sold out. Charles and Lavinia reached even greater heights of fame and fortune after marrying, if that's even possible. Their American fans couldn't help but be enthralled by the newlyweds, especially as a distraction from the horrors of their own nation. 1863 wasn't just the year Charles and Lavinia married, it was also right in the middle of the Civil War. Amazingly, their wedding knocked the conflict off the New York Times front page for 3 whole days. After all, the wedding and their story provided much-needed escapism for a conflict-weary nation. But Charles and Lavinia couldn't charm everyone. Most Americans viewed Charles and Lavinia's wedding and story as a fairy tale, but others were not so convinced. Some cynics believed that this was nothing more than a publicity stunt. Charles responded furiously. He said, "We are simply man and woman of like passions and iniquities with you and other mortals. The arrangements for our marriage are controlled by no showman." But the offensiveness of these cynics paled in comparison to the nosy Nellies during their Paris grand tours. Even President Lincoln held a reception for them at the White House. It was an interesting scene. The newlyweds were famously short, while Lincoln was famously tall. But the legendary politician made them feel more than welcome. When someone rudely asked Charles, "They call you General, do they?" the president interjected, "I wish my generals were as good a general as he is." Charles soon found out the hard way that there were 3 participants in his relationship. This time it wasn't pesky George. It was his fame and the annoying fans that came with it. The newlyweds felt like an army of curiosity mongers was always breathing down their necks. Fame was a double-edged sword, and they'd learned this the hard way over and over again. Charles and Lavinia were magnets for criminals who thought they would be easy victims, especially on their many tours. On one memorable occasion, 2 robbers stalked them. Luckily, the authorities stopped them in the nick of time. But the newlyweds weren't always so lucky. Another time, they found a ton of money missing from their hotel room. It turned out a maid had swiped it, but the girl was so distraught that the couple took mercy on her and didn't press charges. The wedding had lifted Charles and Lavinia's reputations to new heights, but they, including Phineas, wanted more. During their appearances, Lavinia started showing up with babies that everyone assumed were theirs. This addition to their story made the pair even more popular. Eventually, it was claimed that the child had passed, but this was all an elaborate ruse. Lavinia later confessed they rented babies from hospitals and orphanages. It seemed like yet another tall tale, or was it? It gets even weirder. Charles and Lavinia may have actually had a child after all. Centuries later, a historian discovered evidence suggesting that the child wasn't just a hoax. But why would Lavinia randomly confess to lying? Frustratingly, this may always remain an unsolved mystery. That said, starting a family wasn't Charles and Lavinia's only problem. Phineas marketed Charles and Lavinia as childlike because sympathy sold tickets, but this came at a big cost. The 2 performers were adults, accomplished and brilliant, but people infantilized them and crossed boundaries. Fans even wanted to pet and hold Lavinia. She raged. It seemed impossible to make people understand at first that I was not a child, that being a woman, I had the womanly instinct of shrinking from a form of familiarity, which in the case of a child of my size would have been as natural as it was permissible. That was just the beginning. In January 1883, Charles and Lavinia were fast asleep in their room at the Newhall house when frantic, loud knocking jolted Charles awake. Groggy and confused, he opened the door to find an officer rushing inside. In an instant, Charles realized their room was surrounded by fire. They were trapped in the midst of the Newhall House fire, one of the deadliest hotel fires in American history. With growing terror, they understood their only escape was through the window. The officer flung it open and shouted for a ladder. Dressed only in his pajamas, Charles climbed down to safety. The officer followed, carrying Lavinia. Both survived, but 71 others were not so fortunate. Lavinia was deeply thankful they had made it out alive, but Charles didn't share her perspective. Amid the devastation and loss, he complained about the luxurious possessions he had lost in the fire. Appalled by his selfishness, Lavinia scolded him, saying, "So what if we've lost everything? Look at those people over there." She then demonstrated her compassion by helping other survivors, proving she was truly the better half of the pair. Charles may have escaped this fire, but his luck wouldn't hold out next time. As the infantilizing marketing persisted, Charles aged rapidly and ungracefully. His skin didn't just wrinkle, it turned yellow. He gained significant weight and even grew slightly taller. One newspaper harshly described his appearance, stating that Charles looked like an orange that had been sat upon. Most in his position might have stepped away from the spotlight, but Charles couldn't bring himself to do so. After enduring so much to grapple with his health, fame, and wealth, Charles couldn't let go. He was addicted to the attention, once admitting, "I can't do without the excitement of public life." Despite all its chaos, this was the only life he had ever known. Sadly, Charles never got to experience the peace of retirement. On the morning of July 15, 1883, he woke up feeling tired but otherwise fine in his Middleborough mansion. It seemed like any other day. He had a conversation with his brother-in-law, Edward, and shortly after Edward left, a loud thud echoed through the house. Edward rushed back to find Charles collapsed on the floor. He had suffered a fatal stroke. This happened just 6 months after the Newhall House fire. Charles was only 45 years old. Heartbreakingly, Lavinia was not with him. Charles may have been small in stature, but everything else about him was larger than life. He lived with the energy and ambition of 100 men, achieving incredible fame, fortune, and success. His life included a grand wedding, and even his funeral was monumental, drawing over 20,000 attendees. His close friend Phineas honored him with a life-size statue to stand at his grave. Charles left behind a grieving wife, Lavinia, who was about to face another harsh reality. Lavinia had hoped to retire, but she quickly realized she couldn't afford it. Despite the enormous wealth she and Charles had earned, they had spent recklessly, especially Charles. Struggling financially, Lavinia was forced to sell many of her most cherished possessions, including her wedding gifts and jewelry. To make ends meet, she continued working, and during this time, she met her next husband. 2 years after Charles's death, Lavinia married again, this time to Count Primo Magri, an Italian and fellow little person. Primo claimed to be a real count, though the title came with no wealth. As a result, the couple earned their living by running a popular roadside show. Although Lavinia appeared to move on, she never truly got over Charles. She passed away on November 25, 1919, at the age of 78, outliving Charles by 33 years. Her second husband, Primo, survived her by just 1 year. Interestingly, Lavinia was buried next to Charles, but her gravestone simply reads, "His wife." After Charles' passing, his legacy continued to attract attention, both positive and negative. In 1959, vandals senselessly destroyed the statue at his grave. Thankfully, the local community later restored both the statue and his grave to their original condition. Today, his legacy remains strong. He has been celebrated and immortalized in numerous films and performances. One notable example is the 2017 musical film The Greatest Showman, which became a major success, earning $415 million and featuring a star-studded cast. In the film, Charles was portrayed by Sam Humphrey, an actor with skeletal dysplasia, honoring the legacy of history's most famous little person, whose impact remains larger than life. Today, we remember General Tom Thumb not only as a performer, but also as someone whose determination and resilience helped him overcome immense challenges. His story serves as a powerful reminder that, no matter how small or insignificant we may feel, our actions can create a tremendous impact. A flapper on screen, a role she mastered in Enchantment, nearly 2 years before Colleen Moore's iconic turn in Flaming Youth. If Hearst had allowed her to continue in such roles, she might have become the definitive flapper of the era. By the end of 1921, her career was gaining momentum, but she was still searching for her niche. In 1922, a new trend emerged in Hollywood. Actresses taking on dual roles, such as playing both male and female characters or contrasting personalities like a plain sister and a beautiful one. These roles allowed actresses to showcase their versatility, experiment with costumes, and explore a wider range of characters. Marion, with her talent for mimicry and comedy, thrived in such roles, particularly when playing male characters. However, Hearst wasn't thrilled about seeing her dressed as bellboys or street urchins. That year, Marion appeared in 4 films that embraced the dual role trend: The Bride's Play, Beauty's Worth, The Young Diana, and When Knighthood Was in Flower. In The Bride's Play, she portrayed both a modern 1920s woman and Enid of Cashel, a medieval Irish heroine. The film featured stunning location shoots at Point Lobos on California's Monterey Peninsula, not far from Hearst's San Simeon estate, which he had begun building in 1919. The film Beauty's Worth followed a rather over-the-top transformation story. It centered on a plain Quaker girl who, after crossing paths with a free-spirited bohemian artist on a beach, transforms into a glamorous socialite. The movie was shot on location at the breathtaking Point Lobos on the Monterey Peninsula. One of its standout moments was a visually stunning tableau vivant, where Marion Davies recreated her iconic dancing doll routine from the 1916 Ziegfeld Follies. In The Young Diana, Marion played an unattractive spinster who undergoes a dramatic transformation into a stunning young woman after being subjected to some questionable experiments by a scientist. However, the twist? It was all just a dream. By 1922, critics were increasingly vocal about the lavish spending on Marion films. According to the New York Times, she was given more extravagant settings, luxurious costumes, and meticulous direction than nearly any other actor of the time. The paper also raised eyebrows at the overly flattering title cards that described her beauty as pure gold and compared her to a diamond among rhinestones. It was clear that William Randolph Hearst was determined to cement Marion's image as a symbol of beauty, wealth, and sophistication. The grandeur of these productions was largely thanks to Joseph Urban, a renowned Viennese set designer who had previously worked on the Ziegfeld Follies and the Metropolitan Opera. Urban believed cinema was the ultimate modern art form, and Hearst gave him an unlimited budget to bring his vision to life. While Beauty's Worth had already drawn attention for its high costs, it paled in comparison to the scale of When Knighthood Was in Flower. Hearst hired Urban to create elaborate sets, including entire streets, villages, and a meticulously detailed Tudor court. The film's production cost a staggering $5.5 million, equivalent to nearly $100 million today, making it one of the most ambitious cinematic undertakings of its time. The movie, which remains available today, tells a romantic story about the right of young love to prevail. Marion played a fictionalized version of Mary Tudor, who initially defies an arranged marriage to King Louis XV of France in order to protect her true love, Charles Brandon, portrayed by her frequent co-star, Forrest Stanley. Some of the exterior scenes were even filmed at Windsor Castle. Notably, the film also marked William Powell's second-ever screen appearance, where he portrayed King Francis. The premiere of When Knighthood Was in Flower was nothing short of spectacular. Held at New York City's Criterion Theater, the invitation-only event featured a dazzling display that prominently showcased Marion Davies as the star. According to Variety, Hearst organized what was then the most elaborate promotional campaign in theatrical history. This included over 650 billboards across New York, 300 subway ads, souvenir book booths in department stores, and an awe-inspiring collection of electric signs lighting up Times Square. The film managed to capture the spirit of the early 1920s and remains an interesting watch for that reason. Interestingly, it also serves as an early example of Hollywood's ongoing controversy over cultural appropriation. When it premiered in London, British audiences rejected it outright, even booing it off the screen. Critics were outraged at the idea of an American actress portraying a British woman. However, Edward, Prince of Wales, later Edward VIII, reportedly praised it as a wonderful picture. The uproar over ethnic representation didn't seem to bother him, perhaps unsurprising, considering his future choice of spouse. Despite its sentimental and somewhat outdated storyline, the film was well received at the time and marked the beginning of Marion Davies' rise to stardom. In fact, she was crowned the top female box office star of 1922, with Rudolph Valentino taking the title for male stars. By 1923, Marion had earned even more acclaim, particularly for her role in Adam and Eva. Critics applauded her ability to bring a breezy charm and stylish flair to comedic roles. One of her standout films that year was Little Old New York. The movie's sets were painstakingly crafted to evoke a nostalgic, wholesome vision of early New York, a far cry from the bustling, chaotic city we know today. The costumes and decor were especially noteworthy, with a highlight being the detailed recreation of Robert Fulton's revolutionary steamboat. Once again, Marion took on dual roles, playing Patricia O'Day, a young girl who disguises herself as her deceased brother, Patrick, to secure their inheritance. While some critics noted that her feminine features made it hard to believe she could pass as a boy, the film cleverly acknowledged this in a humorous scene where a woman, puzzled by Pat's refusal to kiss her hand, exclaims, "What an impossible little boy!" a playful nod to the obvious. Marion's comedic flair shone in several memorable moments. In one scene, she humorously falls ill after attempting to smoke a pipe in the men's smoking room. In another, she disrupts a bare-knuckle brawl by ringing a fire bell, only to be captured by the furious crowd and tied to a post. Facing the threat of a flogging, she finally confesses she's not actually a boy. This film also marked her first collaboration with Harrison Ford, not the Indiana Jones star, of course, but an earlier actor with the same name. Marion films were often accompanied by lavish marketing campaigns. For instance, in August 1920, a full-page ad in Motion Picture magazine featured a striking photo of her wearing a luxurious fur collar, her hair adorned with fresh roses. The ad bore all the hallmarks of William Randolph Hearst's meticulous influence. While the promotional blitz was undoubtedly savvy business, it also reflected the growing intensity of their personal relationship. By this point, Hearst, long estranged from his wife, Millicent Wilson, was seeking a divorce, though Millicent staunchly refused to grant it. For decades, whispers have swirled about the possibility that Marion Davies and William Randolph Hearst had a secret child between 1919 and 1923. Many believe that this child may have been Patricia Lake, born Patricia Van Cleve, who publicly presented herself as Marion's niece. However, the details surrounding her birth remain hazy. While her Los Angeles Times obituary places her birth sometime between 1920 and 1923, the Social Security Death Index lists it as June 8, 1919, a date that has been widely disputed. Interestingly, even Lake herself reportedly never knew her exact birth date. The official narrative stated that Lake was the daughter of Mary and Rose Van Cleve and Rose's first husband, George Van Cleve. But members of the Lake family have since claimed that Patricia was actually born to Marion and Hearst, then given to Rose after Rose's own infant tragically passed away. Allegedly, the deceased child's birth certificate was altered to mask the truth. In 1924, after Rose and George Van Cleve separated, George reportedly kidnapped Patricia and disappeared. Hearst's private investigators tracked them down 5 years later, and Patricia was returned to Rose's care. However, a court decision eventually placed her back with George. During this time, the Lake family claims that Hearst financially supported Patricia, covering her education in New York and Boston. Patricia also spent significant time with both Hearst and Marion, frequently traveling with them to Europe and appearing in their home movies. She was a regular guest at Hearst's San Simeon estate, and many noted her striking resemblance to Hearst himself. Patricia remained tight-lipped about the rumors throughout her life, even after Hearst and Marion passed away. However, family members have alleged that Hearst privately told Patricia on her wedding day that he was her father. Her wedding, held at San Simeon in 1937, was an extravagant affair, with Hearst and Marion playing prominent roles. If Patricia was born in 1919, she would have been 17 at the time of her wedding. However, if the later birth dates are to be believed, she would have been as young as 13. Just hours before her death in 1993, Patricia reportedly confirmed to her family that Hearst and Marion were her biological parents, urging them to make the truth known. Even so, the full story remains shrouded in mystery. Back in the early 1920s, she was a regular fixture in fan magazines, a clear sign of her widespread popularity at the time. In the June 1920 issue of Motion Picture, she shared some practical wedding advice, saying that if she were planning a wedding on a tight budget, she'd find a way to afford a gown and veil no matter what. The comment was amusingly ironic given her immense wealth. While fan magazines avoided directly addressing her relationship with William Randolph Hearst, they had no problem spotlighting her extravagant lifestyle, and extravagant it was. By 1926, her social calendar was the stuff of legend. Photoplay detailed a week in her life that included hosting a party for Lady Ravensdale, attending Rudolph Valentino's funeral with Pola Negri, celebrating the birth of a Goldwyn baby, and throwing a wedding at her home. She even entertained President Calvin Coolidge, a man known for his reserved demeanor. Despite his reputation for being a bit dull, Marion playfully served him a tropical juice that was actually a potent fruit punch. Much to her amusement, the president ended up tipsy, proving even Silent Cal could let loose under the right circumstances. Marion homes were equally as lavish as her lifestyle. Her Santa Monica beach house, funded by Hearst, was a jaw-dropping 70-room mansion stretching 300 feet along the coast. The property featured a gold leaf ballroom, a massive dining room, a 60-foot drawing room, and a marble swimming pool over 100 feet long, complete with a marble bridge. It was a palace by the Pacific, surrounded by lush gardens. Then there was San Simeon, now a California state park, and one of the grandest estates in the country. This sprawling castle included everything from a refectory to Roman and Greek-style pools, a zoo, and countless opulent rooms. Marion and Hearst also spent time at Wintoon, their Northern California estate, which resembled a whimsical village straight out of a fairy tale, with cottages named after storybook characters like Cinderella and Sleeping Beauty. The couple's legendary parties were the cherry on top of their extravagant lifestyle. At San Simeon, the biggest stars of the 1920s and 1930s gathered for tennis matches, horseback riding, and glamorous costume balls. Marion's masquerade parties were particularly unforgettable, with guests dressing in elaborate costumes. Even Hearst got in on the fun, once dressing as President Madison, while others came as everything from circus clowns to pickpockets. These parties were snapshots of a bygone era. with Hollywood royalty living it up in a world of pure fantasy. In short, Marion Davies wasn't just a silent film star. She was the life of the party, the queen of excess, and a symbol of the roaring 20s glitz and glamour. While Marion Davies led a life that most could only dream of, it still wasn't enough to fully satisfy William Randolph Hearst. Even though he had won the love of his life, his wandering eye never seemed to settle. Hearst, despite being married the entire time, was notoriously jealous and possessive. Decades later, Leda Gray, Charlie Chaplin's second wife, shared a revealing story about Marion. According to Gray, Marion had confided in her about her feelings for Hearst, admitting that she would give everything to marry him, not for his wealth or security, as he had already provided more than she could ever need, nor for his charm, which often bored her, or even for his skills in the bedroom, which she dismissed as unimpressive. Instead, she valued how he made her feel, like she truly mattered to him. Their relationship, however, was far from a fairy tale. Both Marion and Hearst were unfaithful, engaging in numerous affairs. Marion was romantically linked to figures like Charlie Chaplin and Dick Powell, while Hearst had a very public affair with Maybelle Swore, a blonde chorus girl. This particular relationship infuriated Marion, especially since Hearst's newspapers heavily promoted Swore's career, much like they had once done for Marion. Over time, the strain of their tumultuous relationship drove Marion to increasingly rely on alcohol. At social gatherings, Hearst and Marion often kept to themselves, but Hearst enforced strict rules on their guests: only one cocktail per person, and no alcohol allowed in their rooms. These rules were largely aimed at curbing Marion's growing drinking problem, though they were frequently ignored. Despite Hearst's efforts, Marion continued to drink heavily. By 1924, Marion had cemented her place in Hollywood, earning the title of Queen of the Screen through a magazine poll, though considering it was published in a Hearst-owned paper, the results were likely skewed. Her film Janice Meredith, a Revolutionary War epic, took over 8 months to film and cost a fortune, as noted by the Times. The movie featured iconic moments like Paul Revere's ride and George Washington's crossing of the Delaware, with Marion donning 20 different costumes throughout the film. In one memorable sequence, she escapes through a window, rides to warn the troops, and even trudges through snow on foot to complete her mission. The imagery of her braving the elements remains one of the film's most striking elements. With hits like When Knighthood Was in Flower, Little Old New York, and Janice Meredith, Marion became a household name by 1925. Her films were known for their lavish production values, stunning costumes, and a unique blend of comedy and romance set against historical backdrops. Unlike her contemporaries, stars like Colleen Moore, Clara Bow, and the Talmadge sisters, Marion stood out as a comedic actress who brought authenticity and warmth to her roles. Yet, while her career soared, her personal life grew increasingly complicated and, at times, perilous. In November 1924, Marion Davies joined a group of partygoers aboard William Randolph Hearst's luxurious steam yacht, Oneida, for what was supposed to be a celebratory weekend. The occasion? The birthday of film producer Thomas Ince, and a chance to finalize a business deal between Hearst's Cosmopolitan Productions and Ince's studio. Hearst himself had invited Ince during a visit to the producer's Benedict Canyon estate, Diaz Dorado. However, the weekend took a dark turn. Reports claimed that Ince suffered from severe indigestion while on the yacht. Hearst's studio manager, Dr. Daniel Goodman, helped him disembark in San Diego, where he boarded a train bound for Los Angeles. Unfortunately, Ince's condition worsened en route, forcing the train to stop in Del Mar. There, Dr. T.A. Parker and a nurse, Jessie Howard, attended to him. Allegedly, Ince admitted to consuming a particularly strong cocktail on the yacht. He was eventually taken back to his Hollywood home, where he passed away. Ince's death quickly became the subject of wild speculation. Some rumors suggested Hearst had shot Ince in a fit of jealousy after catching him making advances toward Marion. Another version claimed that Hearst had intended to shoot Charlie Chaplin, who was rumored to be romantically involved with Marion, but accidentally hit Ince instead. Chaplin's valet reportedly claimed to have seen Ince being carried off the yacht with a head wound, fueling these theories. Screenwriter Eleanor Glynn, who was also present at the party, later remarked that guests were sworn to secrecy, a strange request if Ince had died of natural causes. Years later, Lita Gray, Chaplin's wife, echoed the story of a violent altercation aboard the yacht. Yet, despite the whispers and accusations, no solid evidence ever emerged to support these claims. San Diego's District Attorney Chester C. Kempley eventually declared that Ince's death was due to heart failure caused by acute indigestion. With 3 doctors and a nurse involved in his care, the official explanation seemed clear. Still, the rumors of foul play persisted, and, to this day, some corners of Hollywood remain convinced that jealousy and rage led to Ince's untimely death. Amid the scandal, Marion continued her career with the 1925 film Lights of Old Broadway, directed by Monta Bell. She showcased her signature talent for dual roles, playing twins separated at birth. One twin, Felyandi, grows up in a poor Irish family, while the other, Anne Dondo, is raised by an affluent Dutch family in New York. Marion's ability to bring both characters to life was a testament to her versatility. Another standout performance came in Beverly of Graustark, directed by Sidney Franklin and based on George Barr McCutcheon's beloved novel. In this lighthearted tale, Marion played Beverly, a spirited young woman who impersonates her cousin Oscar to secure his claim to the throne of Graustark. The role allowed Marion to shine in another dual performance, first as a fashionable New York flapper, and then as a convincingly androgynous Oscar, complete with short hair and sharply tailored military uniforms. Her bold, modern appearance in the film would still turn heads in today's fashion-forward world. The Red Mill made a big splash on Broadway, so adapting it for the silver screen seemed like a no-brainer for Marion Davies. In the 1927 film version, Marion played a Dutch girl working at the titular inn. The production spared no expense, creating an elaborate Dutch village complete with a canal, a windmill, and a detailed inn. While critics praised the ice skating scenes, they were less kind to the slapstick humor. Marion endured a series of over-the-top antics, including falling through ice, tumbling into a well, wrestling with an ironing board for what felt like an eternity, and even getting spanked by the innkeeper. The grand finale. She ends up trapped inside the old mill. Without its original musical score, the movie leaned heavily on its plot, which wasn't exactly riveting. Still, audiences adored Marion, and her charm carried the film. After The Red Mill, her first release of 1927, Marion went on to make 6 more films before the arrival of sound cinema, which marked her transition into talkies. Among her silent comedies, 5 films stood out: Tilly the Toiler, The Fair Coed, Quality Street, The Patsy, and Show People. The latter 2 are widely considered her best work. Marion had found her niche, blending humor with authenticity. In fact, many believed she came closest to portraying her true self on screen. Her comedic brilliance shone brightest in Show People, often regarded as her masterpiece. Directed by King Vidor and co-starring William Haynes, the film was a sharp satire of Hollywood's star-making machine. It was also her final silent film. Shot on the MGM studio lot in Los Angeles, it featured cameos from Hollywood icons like Charlie Chaplin, John Gilbert, Douglas Fairbanks, and even Marion herself. One standout moment saw Marion's real-life self crossing paths with her character Peggy Pepper on the studio lot. Audiences also loved her hilarious parody of Gloria Swanson, which even Swanson's fans found charming. In July 1928, Marion and William Randolph Hearst embarked on a European tour with a dozen of her closest girlfriends. When they returned in October, Hollywood had fully embraced sound films. This shift worried Marion because of her lifelong stutter. After watching Al Jolson's second talkie, The Singing Fool, she was so moved by his performance of Sonny Boy that she broke down, convinced her career was over, but those fears were unfounded. Marion's voice, a low and humorous tone, turned out to be a pleasant surprise. Unlike some silent stars who struggled with accents, shrill voices, or a lack of musical talent, Marion adapted with ease. Her sound test confirmed that her stutter could be managed, and she successfully transitioned into talkies. Her first sound film, The Hollywood Review of 1929, showcased her Broadway roots as a singer and dancer. In one memorable scene, she performed alongside a chorus of male dancers dressed as grenadier guards. Initially dwarfed by the towering soldiers, she soon stole the spotlight, dancing on a giant drum and singing with confidence. Over the course of her career, she made 15 sound films, though most are not held in high regard today. A few exceptions stand out, including the delightful musical Going Hollywood with Bing Crosby, the screwball comedy Cain and Mabel with Clark Gable, and Hearts Divided, a quirky tale about Napoleon's brother in America. While these later films may not have cemented her legacy, they proved that Marion Davies could thrive in any era of Hollywood. Hearst and Marion Davies took a trip to Europe for some downtime, and during their visit to Versailles, Hearst found inspiration in Stefan Zweig's biography of Marie Antoinette. He thought it would make the perfect film for Marion. However, MGM owned the rights to the book, and while Louis B. Mayer was open to selling them, he insisted Hearst cover the entire production cost. Complications arose when Norma Shearer, the wife of MGM executive Irving Thalberg, expressed interest in the role as well. Tensions between Mayer and Hearst escalated, leading Hearst to sever ties with MGM and Shearer. Reflecting on the incident, Marion later said that the Marie Antoinette project was the breaking point for her relationship with MGM. She recalled how Hearst, angrier than she was, declared they'd never work with the studio again. Mayer, she noted, wasn't too upset about losing her, but did regret losing Hearst, whom he described as the queen in their chess game of power. Not long after, Marion's famous bungalow was carefully dismantled and moved to the Warner Brothers lot in Burbank. This transition happened quickly, sealed by a brief 5-minute conversation between Hearst and Jack Warner. Marion went on to enjoy a respectable career in the sound film era, outlasting many silent-era stars like Mary Pickford and Clara Bow. Her final film, Ever Since Eve, showcased her once again in a dual role, playing a secretary who disguises herself to fend off unwanted advances. It was a fitting end to her career, though her departure from Hollywood came sooner than expected. Around the same time, the Hearst empire also began to crumble. By 1937, William Randolph Hearst's seemingly unshakable empire was collapsing under the weight of the Great Depression. Facing massive financial troubles, Hearst was forced to sell much of the contents of St. Donat's Castle. Marion, ever loyal, sold her jewelry and investments, and even wrote a $1 million check to help him avoid bankruptcy. Hearst's debts were staggering, totaling $126 million, equivalent to over $2.6 billion today. When Hearst's Cosmopolitan Pictures shut down in 1938, Marion left the film industry and returned to San Simeon. In her autobiography, she admitted she had grown tired of acting and chose instead to focus on being Hearst's companion. During the late 1930s and 1940s, her drinking worsened, and she and Hearst became increasingly reclusive. Their once glamorous lifestyle began to fade, resembling a modern Gothic ruin. They spent much of World War II at Hearst's Wintoun estate before returning to San Simeon in 1945. Although Marion made occasional radio appearances, she lamented the restrictions of her acting career. She once noted that even though she only worked on 2 films a year, she couldn't fully enjoy her time off. Travel was limited, and she had to avoid things like sunburn or overeating to maintain her image. Despite these challenges, it seems she and Hearst found some joy in her retirement, even as financial troubles and her drinking persisted. Marion's films, while popular, were rarely celebrated for their artistic merit. However, she was known for her generosity, often anonymously paying for the medical expenses of her colleagues. But her legacy was about to take an unexpected turn, one she could neither predict nor control. On May 8, 1941, Citizen Kane premiered, forever altering how the world viewed Hearst, and by extension, Marion. The pair likely watched the film together in a San Francisco theater. Hearst biographer John Tebble speculated that Hearst might have found the portrayal of himself, played by the dashing Orson Welles, as a cunning rogue somewhat flattering. After all, Hearst had endured far harsher criticism over the years. However, the character of Susan Alexander, widely interpreted as a depiction of Marion, enraged him. Hearst was deeply offended by the suggestion that this fictional character represented the woman he loved, and it was clear the public would draw that conclusion. The release of Citizen Kane marked a turning point, casting a long shadow over both their legacies. Marion Davies was often unfairly overshadowed by the character of Susan Alexander in Citizen Kane, a portrayal that painted her as a talentless singer propped up by the wealth and influence of her lover, Charles Foster Kane. While Marion reportedly found the film upsetting, she chose to follow advice once given to her by William Randolph Hearst. Reflecting on his words, she mentioned that he had told her to ignore insults and make as little fuss as possible about them. Taking this to heart, she dismissed Citizen Kane, adding with a touch of humor that the film never made much money anyway. It was a sharp and understated critique, perfectly capturing her wit. Though Citizen Kane didn't achieve box office success at the time, Marion couldn't have predicted the seismic impact it would have on cinema history. To her, it seemed absurd that a relatively obscure RKO film by a first-time director could overshadow her 2 decades of stardom. She underestimated the film's staying power and the way it would reshape public perception, not just of her, but of the silent film era as a whole. By the 1950s, Marion's reputation had been unfairly reduced to that of Susan Alexander's supposed inspiration, a gross misrepresentation that ignored her genuine talent and success. Even her obituaries painted her as a mediocre actress, despite the fact that most of her films were box office hits. Movies like When Knighthood Was in Flower and Little Old New York were among the highest-grossing films of their time, proving her star power. Unfortunately, the shadow of Citizen Kane lingered, perpetuating the myth that she was little more than a talentless opportunist. Later in life, Orson Welles himself sought to set the record straight. In the foreword to Marion's posthumous autobiography, The Times We Had, he made it clear that Susan Alexander and Marion Davies were nothing alike. He explained that while Susan was portrayed as Kane's unhappy, imprisoned wife, Marion was Hearst's cherished partner, a woman he adored for over 30 years. Welles described their relationship as a true love story, emphasizing that Hearst was always devoted to her, treating her not as a possession, but as the treasure of his heart. He also pointed out that Hearst's lavish estates, including the legendary San Simeon, were places of joy and celebration. Marion reigned there as a gracious hostess, not a tragic figure trapped in isolation like Susan Alexander. Welles further clarified to filmmaker Peter Bogdanovich that Susan Alexander's character wasn't based on Marion at all. Instead, the inspiration came from real-life figures like Samuel Insull, who built the Chicago Opera House, and Harold Fowler McCormick, who famously promoted his wife, Ganna Walska's opera career. Decades after Marion's death, a re-evaluation of her work began to emerge, helped by the increased availability of her films. As audiences revisited her performances, particularly her comedic roles, they discovered a sharp, natural talent that had been overlooked for far too long. In hindsight, the association with Susan Alexander was a profound injustice to Marion Davies. She was a legitimate star, a box office draw, and a gifted actress whose legacy deserved far more respect than it initially received. On April 29, 1951, William Randolph Hearst turned 88, but his declining health kept him confined to his room. Marion Davies, ever devoted, arranged a small celebration upstairs with 5 of her closest friends. Her gift to him was deeply personal, a painting of his mother, Phoebe Hearst, holding him as a baby. The gesture brought Hearst to tears, and Marion, kneeling by his side, comforted him, urging him that everything would be all right. Just a few months later, on August 14, 1951, Hearst passed away. Marion, exhausted from caring for him, was asleep at the time. By the time she woke up, his body had already been taken away by his sons, who brought him to rest with his estranged wife. This left Marion heartbroken. She later expressed her devastation, saying she felt robbed of the chance to say goodbye to the man she had loved for 32 years. She described it as if they had taken something that belonged to her, leaving her utterly alone. Just 10 weeks after Hearst's death, Marion married for the first time, tying the knot with Captain Horace Brown of the California State Guard, who bore a resemblance to a younger Hearst. However, her life came to a close on September 23, 1961, when she succumbed to cancer. Marion was laid to rest in the Doris family crypt in Hollywood. After her death, her extensive jewelry collection was cataloged, including standout pieces like a 29-carat diamond pendant, a platinum diamond watch, and even a gold toothpick. She also left behind tape recordings for a memoir, brimming with stories about her life and her love for Hearst. She recalled his playful side, mentioning how he'd sometimes break into a tap dance just for fun. Marion described him as kind, innocent, and utterly incapable of harming anyone. She remembered him confessing his love for her, to which she would simply reply, "Let it ride. It's all right with me." And so, she did. She let it ride for a lifetime. Marion Davies remains a singular figure in Hollywood history. While today's film stars may sometimes have their careers shaped by powerful romantic partners, Marion stands as the most iconic example of this dynamic in Hollywood's golden age. To the public, and even in her own eyes, she was known first as Hearst's mistress, and second as an actress. Hearst, a man shaped by Victorian ideals, believed that a wealthy man should support his mistress financially, ensuring her comfort even as time passed. While others in his position might have helped their lovers move on by setting up businesses or other ventures, Hearst never replaced Marion. Instead, he gave her something extraordinary. He made her a movie star, and she embraced that role with enthusiasm. Over the years, her legacy has been unfairly tarnished. Critics have dismissed her as a gold digger or a talentless actress, but these claims couldn't be further from the truth. Marion entered the film industry on her own initiative, overcoming a stutter to become one of the rare stars who successfully transitioned from silent films to talkies. Her name lit up marquees, and her popularity with moviegoers proved that she was far more than just a product of Hearst's wealth. Audiences adored her, flocking to see her films, even if critics turned up their noses. Marion Davies was a true star, beloved by the people who mattered most, her fans. And that's a wrap for this episode. Thanks for tuning in, and until next time.